Okay. Now somebody asked me something after the last class that made me think it might be beneficial for me to say a word about my philosophy on commentaries. Okay, I explained this once before, several years ago, in a class I did titled Becoming a Better Teacher, but maybe it bears repeating. Commentaries, they're of course an uninspired author's attempt to explain what an inspired author intends to communicate in a given text of Scripture. Some of them are certainly better than others, but I find them invaluable for in-depth study of the Bible. Usually for $60 or less, one can get a decade or more of a scholar's labor. I know one fellow, a professor who has doctorate in Old Testament and in New Testament. He's been working on a commentary on the Minor Prophets for 60 years. That's not a joke. And he was going to have it published by Baker, and they didn't. They had just published the deal on the Minor Prophets, but he's still checking the citations. And he said that he should have kept that in mind back when he started this. So he's going back doing it. But so you get that kind of labor and that kind of time. Now, I'm not one who shies away from commentaries merely because they're the word of man. I've had people say that to me before, and that kind of idea that, well, that's just the word of man. Why do you want to spend time with that? You know, certainly they're the word of man, but so is all teaching that is not inspired by God. And if being the word of man makes commentaries, you shouldn't read them because they're the word of man, well, then you shouldn't attend a Bible class because it's the word of man. What do you think I'm saying? You see, so if they're unworthy of being read because they're the word of man, then it strikes me that all of our Bible classes are unworthy of attending because they're the word of man. And if I thought that, I wouldn't be teaching. So obviously I think there can be value in that anyway. And neither am I one who shies away from commentaries written by Jewish scholars or scholars outside the Church of Christ. And the fact we all read and study from translations and from Bible commentaries or Bible dictionaries from people that were produced by people not in our brotherhood shows that we already acknowledge that a person can be a good scholar and produce worthy material without being part of the church. Right? I mean, we read from translations. We don't, who reads Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek just sits down and cracks that open? And besides that, we're dependent on them for the text. Because there has to be work involved in what is the original text that was written. Alright, so we're dependent on them, so I don't shy away from them. What I want in a commentary is a knowledgeable and reliable source of information from somebody who takes the Bible seriously and who explains the basis of his conclusions. I will then take the offering, I'll sort through it, and I will separate the meat from the bones. So that's how I look at it, and so I try to use the best commentaries that are available, and I use them as resources. Now I understand the caution that some have regarding biblical scholarship. There are plenty of examples of scholars who've wandered into theological liberalism, and I don't doubt that their education had something to do with it. But turning one's back on scholarship in general is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And as I say, it's impossible because we are dependent on scholars for the meaning of the ancient languages in which the Bible was written. We're dependent on them for the information about the historical circumstances, the culture, all of that. You and I are separated from when the Bible was written by the language, the time, the culture, and we have to have a way back that way. And so it's an important thing. So I use scholars freely, but I do so with discernment. I don't just take what they write and say, okay, this is the Bible. It's not the Bible. But oftentimes it can help in one's understanding of the Bible. Okay, so there's for those who wonder, that's my philosophy. So I use them with discernment. All right, when we ended last week, we were looking at Ruth, chapter 1, verses 1 to 5. Let me read that, and then we'll talk some more about it. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem and Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. And you see in chapter 1, verse 1, that the events reported, as we mentioned last week, the events reported, they took place in the days when the judges ruled. And that's this era, this period, this dark time in Israel's history when it says there was no king and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. It was a time of chaos, a very difficult time. And the period of judges, as I said a couple of times last week, it began shortly after Joshua's death, which we can guess at around 1366 BC. And it ended with the anointing of Saul as king around 1051 BC. So we have that's the time, and you see that this is written back then. Now in those days, it says a famine came on the land, which prompted Elimelech, an Ephrathite from Bethlehem in Judah. It prompted him to move with his wife Naomi and their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, to move to Moab. And I spent probably more time than I should have last week talking about there are people that perceive this move as something that's wrong. In other words, that he shouldn't have gone to Moab. And then that affects how they look at the story. So they say, well, the journey to Moab, that was not something that was proper because God was disciplining them for sin. He should have stayed there and helped bring the country to repentance. He fled to Moab, which was an inveterate enemy of Israel or Judah. So Israel. So you say, okay, that's an indication that he was faithless. Therefore, God is punishing, that kind of thing. I explained why I didn't think that was the case. Now, the names of the family members, when we ended last week, I just mentioned the names of these family members, the 4, Elimelech, Naomi, Mahlon, and Chilion. They occur only here in the Old Testament. But the names of 3 of them, all except Mahlon, they have counterparts in other literature in the ancient Near East, other documents that have been unearthed. In Ugarit and Mari and Amarna. You see that these texts here, so they have counterparts, so we know these are names that people had. Now Naomi, as you probably know, it means good, pleasant, lovely. That's the meaning of that name. And since that's the only name, the meaning of which is played on in the book, even if we could understand and be confident of what the other names meant, if they meant anything, since Naomi's the only one that gets any play in the book, knowing the others doesn't seem relevant. Okay, hers is the only one, so even if we could know them, nothing is made of their meaning. Whereas in chapter 1, verse 20, you see that something is made of the meaning of Naomi. Now the author's careful, I pointed out last week a couple of times, the author's careful to note the origin of Elimelech's family. And this is an important tie to David. You see, it says, the first states in verse 1, that Elimelech was from Bethlehem in Judah, and then specifies that he and his family, they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. And we look at that and say, well, that doesn't really mean that much. But this thing, Ephrathites, as Robert Hubbard says, he says this expression was probably an ethnic way of specifying the clan within the tribe of Judah to which the family belonged. So you have Ephrathites being an ethnic way of saying this is a particular clan. So clans are subsets of tribes. So we have a tribe of Judah, but there is a clan of that tribe, Ephrathites. And so he says they're from Bethlehem and Judah. Then he says the family, they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem and Judah. And given that David was the son of an Ephrathite from Bethlehem and Judah, you see in 1 Samuel 17:12, that repeated detail and the emphasis, Bethlehem and Judah, an Ephrathite from Bethlehem and Judah, would say to a reader, this is after David has risen to prominence. So now you see this marker and this indication. It would raise the expectation that a reader is going to say, okay, what is going to be the connection? Here is this guy, an Ephrathite from Bethlehem and Judah. We know the Ephrathite from Bethlehem and Judah, the great King David. So here he is back in the period of the judges before David. We know the greatness of David. What's going to be the connection? And so that's, it from the very beginning, and then you have at the end when you have the listing of David and the genealogy there, as I said last week. Now after Elimelech died, Naomi's 2 sons, they each took a Moabite wife. One is named Orpah and the other is named Ruth. And then there's a statement they lived there about 10 years. Now that statement, it could refer to the entire time that Mahlon and Chilion had lived in Moab, or it could refer to the time they had lived there as married men. Okay, there's just no way of being certain now. I tend to think it's the latter, that it refers to the time they lived there as married men. And I tend to think that because you see in chapter 1, verse 11, that Naomi is beyond the age of childbearing. And that makes more sense that they lived there a bit longer to get her to that age, making guesses about how old she would be when she married and had kids and that kind of thing. So I tend to think that they lived there 10 years as married people. And then after that statement, you're waiting to hear something. You say, okay, she suffered this loss of her husband, but her sons have taken wives, and you're waiting for what happened. They lived there 10 years, and they had children, and they this, and they that, and what do you get? It says they lived there for 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died. You see there, in writing this, you see this thing, and they took wives, and they lived there 10 years. Well, you're waiting for some kind of report of their lives during the 10 years, and what do you get? They died. So this is a dark, a bummer coming here. Husband's dead. Children are dead. And that really forms, I think, that, it's a key thing to the story. Now, a number of scholars believe that the author expected the readers to understand that it was sinful for the children, for Mahlon and Chilion, to take Moabite wives. And that therefore Naomi was wrong in allowing her sons to marry these Moabite women. Okay, now there are people that think that and they say, okay, that's it. And so then we have another one of these things where they say, you see, that's how you read it. Not only were they wrong to come out and go into Moab, but here we show Naomi exhibiting her faithlessness in allowing her sons to do wrong, to sin by marrying Moabite women. So again, you see that she's painted as faithless, rebellious, and this kind of thing. And then the idea, the theology then becomes she's being disciplined and punished for her rebellion against God. Okay, I don't share that view. I explained why I didn't share the view about Moab. I'm going to try to go quickly through why I don't think that's a right view of their marrying the Moabite women. I don't think it was sinful for them to marry the Moabite women. Okay, one of the things, as I said last week, God reverses Naomi's emptiness without any acknowledgement of wrong or change of attitude on her part. And I think that's very significant. As I said, some people say, well, she went back to Bethlehem, and I pointed out last week that that's not an indication of a change of heart or repentance. She went back only when the famine ended. That's the same very reason she left. So that's nothing different. If the famine hadn't been there, she'd have never left. When the famine ended, she went back. So I don't think you can say, okay, that represents some kind of repentance. There is no indication of a change of attitude or repentance on her part. And if the author intended to suggest that she was faithless for allowing her sons to marry Moabites, then certainly you'd expect some hint of repentance to precede God's removing her emptiness and blessing her. And you don't get that. Otherwise, the implication is that God is blessing her in her impenitence. So right, just for that reason, I think there's something off with that. But the issue of whether the Mosaic law prohibited Mahlon and Chilion from marrying these Moabite women, the issue there is surprisingly complicated. And I side there, you have scholars on both sides of this. I side with those who think, no, it wasn't sinful. And for me to say that, now maybe I toyed with the idea of just saying that to you. Say, that's my thought, my conclusion is that. But then you'd be going, well, if you don't think that, then you'd be going, well, this guy's crazy. So let me sketch for you and run through. When I finish this, I'll put all the notes up on the site, and you can have at them there. But let me tell you how I look at this. The Jews, they're expressly forbidden in Exodus 34, 11 to 16, Deuteronomy 7, 1 to 4, and you can also look at Joshua 23, verses 12 to 13. They're forbidden from marrying people from the nations they were dispossessing. When they come into the promised land, you have this thing that the nations where you're dispossessing. But that doesn't include Moab. Moab wasn't among those nations they were dispossessing. So you say, okay, well, Deuteronomy 23, 3 through 6, it forbids any Moabite from entering the assembly of the Lord even to 10 generations. But that's not a prohibition against marrying them. Yes. I don't know. I don't remember. Yes. From Lot. Yes. Well, they list, in Deuteronomy, he lists the nations. And, you see where Moab is, too. So they're not among the nations they're dispossessing. So it's pretty clear they're not within the prohibition of Deuteronomy in that Exodus text. But there's more to the story. So they're not listed there. But then you have this question of Deuteronomy 23 where he says that, look, they can't enter the assembly of the Lord. But that's not a prohibition against marrying them. Okay, they can't enter the assembly of the Lord. You had eunuchs who couldn't enter the assembly of the Lord in Deuteronomy 23:1. You had those born of certain kinds of forbidden marriages in 23:2 of Deuteronomy who couldn't enter the assembly of the Lord. They could be part of Israel, but they can't enter the assembly of the Lord. They weren't full members of the worshiping community. So here's what Christopher Wright in his commentary on Deuteronomy says about this idea of how you could have Israelites and then you had some people, a small group of those people who were Israelites but weren't allowed to enter the worshiping community. He says, the assembly of the Lord means the assembly of those who belong fully to the covenant community and gather for worship. See, so they couldn't enter the assembly of the Lord even to 10 generations, which most people think mean forever. Okay, he says this body is not quite coextensive with the whole nation, which includes various people who are not full members of the worshiping community. 3 groups are here excluded from membership in the community. That's the eunuchs, those born of certain forbidden marriages, and the Moabites. So I just wanted, if you were thinking, you'd say, okay, well, how does that fit in? That's not a prohibition against marrying them. Okay, it is a restriction on their full participation. Now, given that Ruth apparently converts to Judaism, and you can see that in 1:16 in Ruth Book of Ruth 2:12, the ban on Moabites entering the assembly of the Lord, it wouldn't apply to the offspring she bore to Boaz, to Obed. Because you're saying, wait a minute, if they're barred from that for 10 generations, and if that means forever, or even if it just meant 10 generations, then her son would be barred. But that's not true. Because if, as seems the case, she's a proselyte, as Craig Keener writes in his article on marriage in the Dictionary of the New Testament Background, he says, a child conceived in the womb of a proselyte was himself a full Israelite. Okay, so there'd be no bar, no problem, no prohibition with Obed being a full participant in the worshiping community. Now, some people say, look, all right, I hear all that and I understand all that, but 1 Kings chapter 11 verses 1 to 8, one scholar in particular argues this, that 1 Kings chapter 11 verses 1 to 8 establishes that marrying a Moabite at least comes within the principle of Deuteronomy chapter 7, where this idea where it says that you're not to marry from the nations you're dispossessing. Yes, that doesn't include Moabites, but when you look in 1 Kings 11, it seems that the principle of Deuteronomy 7 does apply to Moabites. Okay, and as you can imagine, I don't think that's right. Okay, because of the position that I'm presenting to you. Now, the meaning of 1 Kings 11, 1 and 2, it seems to be, here's how I understand that. It seems to me to be that Solomon loved many foreign women from the nations that were specified in Deuteronomy 7:1, the nations that you cannot marry from these nations. He loved many foreign women from those nations along with foreign women from other nations. Okay, here's how I look at that. Here's 1 Kings 11, 1 and 2. Now this is the English Standard Version. The only modification I've made is I've added parentheses. See, and this is how, because this represents how I understand it. He says, now King Solomon loved many foreign women. Then there's a parentheses. And if you go down to verse 2, he loved many foreign women from the nations concerning which the Lord had said. So he loved many foreign women from the specified nations in Deuteronomy chapter 7. But with the parentheses says, now King Solomon loved many foreign women along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women. Okay, from the nations. So he loves those from the nations expressly prohibited, and he loved foreign women from other places. He was into foreign women. Okay, so that's how I look at that. And he says, from those nations the Lord had said, you shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their God. Solomon clung to these in love. So if you add a parenthesis, you could do it with a dash, I think that captures the meaning. Now you say, well, wait a minute. In Deuteronomy chapter 7, one of the nations listed, the Hittites are listed. Okay, well then how can you claim that these are two separate groups? How can you say that in 1 Kings 11 that you've got two separate groups? You have those groups that were specifically prohibited in Deuteronomy chapter 7, and then you have another separate group along with daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, when you have Hittites that are common to both groups. Well, you know, that kind of messes up the way I'm looking at it. Okay, well, it turns out that there are two kinds of Hittites. You say, that seems pretty convenient. Well, convenient or not, it's true. Okay? Convenient or not, it's true. The Hittites in chapter 11, verse 1, they're not the same group as the Hittites in 34:11 and Deuteronomy 7:1. So the distinction between the two is complete. You say, well, why should I believe that? Well, let me give you at least this. This is Philip Satterthwaite and David Baker. This is from the Dictionary of the Old Testament on the Pentateuch. They have a Dictionary of the Old Testament. They have Pentateuch, the writings, and they have a number of different volumes. This is from the volume on the Pentateuch. It says, apart from these Hittites in Palestine, further references to Hittites in the north of Israel should be identified with the Neo-Hittite city-states that had belonged to the Anatolian Hittite Empire before its fall and continued to be identified by that name. Judges 1:26, 1 Kings 10:29, 11:1, what do you know? 2 Kings 7:6, possibly Joshua 1:4. Were the two groups ethnically distinct? The Hittite Empire never extended as far south as Hebron, Damascus probably being the furthest south they came, suggesting that the two groups were not identical. Okay, Gregory McMahon in the Anchor Bible Dictionary in his article, Hittites in the Old Testament, he says, we must then distinguish between the sons of Heth of Palestine and the men of Hadi of Anatolia, northern Syria. All right, so that's how I'm looking at that. So I say these things because when I say that I don't think the Mosaic law prohibited the marriage of Mahlon and Chilion to Moabites in Moab. And you'd be saying, well, like, what about this text? What about that text? And I'm trying to run through them for you to tell you that I've thought about some of these things, and this is how I put these pieces together. 1 Kings 11, 1-8, it demonstrates the danger that all unconverted foreign wives pose. Now, there's no question about that. That they all pose a danger, whether they're included in the ban of Deuteronomy 7, 1-4 or not, but that's different from a prohibition against marrying them. Okay, so I don't think that there is this thing about a prohibition against Mahlon and Chilion. Now, I'm not through because you have to be thinking, well, what about Ezra and Nehemiah? All right, Ezra and Nehemiah got some really... When Israel returned to Palestine after the exile, okay, now we're talking about over 500 years after the period of Judges. Okay, the exile, 586, 587, they go into Babylonian exile, 539, they're freed to come back. And so we're talking centuries later, when Israel returns to Palestine after the exile, the principle of not marrying indigenous foreigners, see, in those who were there in the land, of not marrying indigenous foreigners, apply to those of other nations that now are in the land. 5 centuries later, we apparently have different groups who now have communities in Israel, and so when they come back after the exile, you wind up saying, listen, he rebukes them for having taken these wives. He decries the people for not having separated themselves from the people of the lands with their abominations, from the Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites, Ammonites, Moabites. Okay, the way I'm looking at that is that we then have, because he then goes on and he says, look, what did the description in Ezra 9, 10-12, what commandment had they violated? And it said when they had violated refers to the people in the land they were entering. Again, the promised land. So it looks to me like it is still the notion of indigenous foreigners, see, who are in the land. Okay, so Moabites were not in the land during the conquest. But when they came back out, apparently they were. At least communities of them. And I think that's the same thing that lies behind Nehemiah's rebuke. As Robert Hubbard says, Esther shows that Ezra and Nehemiah's prohibition was apparently not considered valid in a foreign land. Right? I mean, her marriage to the Persian king Ahasuerus, his Greek name Xerxes, her marriage to that king was what? It was God's plan for saving Israel. All right, so all that's a long way of saying, I don't think that they were prohibited. There are scholars that say that, believe that and argue along the lines I've just said. I've tried to explain to you as quickly as I could why I don't think that's the case, because it is important in how you understand the theology of the book of Ruth. Because if you have Ruth as being this faithless person who's out turning her back on God and sinning, it puts a different cast on what is happening in the story. As I said last week, I see her more as Job. I see her as this woman who has been dealt a hand in life that is really horrible. And she can't understand why. She knows that she just sits there going, He's killing me. And I don't, okay, I'm not sinless, but, I didn't do anything that deserves this. He's targeted me. He's after me. And I think that'll change how we look at it. Now you might be thinking, okay, Boaz, he marries Ruth in the land of Israel. You say, what about that? Well, Moabites, presumably, they weren't an established community in Israel back at that time. Okay? But in any event, even if they were, his is a levirate-like or a kinsman-redeemer marriage, so it's distinguished. You see, which is where you have that it's different from other marriages because it's a fulfillment of a duty. Okay, so I would distinguish it that way, even if they were in communities of Moabites at that time. All right? Don't know if that was helpful, confusing. The bottom line is, all of that I said just to give you some understanding that I didn't just say, I think I'll just say this. I spent an awful lot of time rooting through this stuff, trying to see what do I think. So that's what I think. I can be wrong. But that's where I am. And so that colors how I read it and how I'm going to, how I'll draw things out. Okay, but I wanted to let you know that I don't think Mahlon and Chilion violated the Mosaic law by marrying Moabite women in Moab. All right, here we go. Sinful to marry her. It wouldn't be in the Bible. You'd have, somebody say, well, maybe for Boaz to marry because of a levirate type thing. But then they'd say, well, still for Mahlon and Chilion to have done it, it would be. And then they take the idea they didn't have children for 10 years and they say, you see, that was God's curse on them kind of thing. But I don't know if you heard that. He was saying that it seems to go along with the idea that it was not sinful for them to do it, that here it is being held up in the Bible that we have Boaz marrying this Moabite. And she actually, in fact, is in David's genealogy. I mean, quoted in the New Testament, mentioned in the New Testament. So, all right, but I say all that because that's where I am with that. Now, Mahlon and Chilion, they die without having had any children, leaving Elimelech's line on the verge of extinction. And I mentioned last week, this is a much greater thing to an ancient Jew than we appreciate. Because it was like their legacy, their existence on earth dies out. And I just don't think we think about that. See, so an original reader reading this is thinking, ooh, that was one of the worst curses you could put on somebody, was that their line would be extinguished. You see, so we miss all that, see, from original readers saying, ooh. See, his line is on the verge of extinction. So we have that aspect of it here. And they die without leaving any children, which also leaves Naomi without what? Without provision and protection. I again said last week, see, this is another thing. We just think a woman who's without male connections in our society, we just don't grasp how dire a situation that was. It was a terrible spot for them to be in. As a childless, aging widow, she's in the worst possible position for an Israelite woman. Frederick Bush, in his commentary, he quotes Phyllis Tribble's assessment of Naomi's dire condition. She says, from wife to widow, from mother to no mother, this female is stripped of all identity. The security of husband and children, which a male-dominated culture afforded its women, is hers no longer. The definition of worth by which it values the female applies to her no more. The blessings of old age, which it gives through progeny, are there no longer. Stranger in a foreign land, this woman is a victim of death and of life. And it just is to understand something. I think it's important to see how she is. And you can feel her. You can feel Naomi's anguish in her description of her situation. In 1:13, she describes it as too bitter or exceedingly bitter. in her statement in 120 that the Almighty had dealt very bitterly with her. And her statement in 121 that she was empty and that the Almighty had brought calamity on her. So you see this sense here. I mean, she's, just exceedingly bitter. Very bitterly He's dealt with me. He's brought calamity on me. I'm empty. Completely. Just everything taken from me. Wasted. And you have to get something that a reader, a first century reader, when this was written, that reader, an ancient reader would get when looking at this. You have to be able to see and feel the distress that she's in. Now, I think there's more than a little truth in the statement by Bill Arnold and Brian Byer in their book, Encountering the Old Testament. It says, though the book is named for Ruth, the story's really about Naomi and the reversal of her life's sad circumstances. That really seems to be the plot line. And similarly, Daniel Block says, based on the plot, the book is more appropriately titled The Book of Naomi. Because here we have what gets reversed. The whole thing winds up here in chapter 1, verses 3 through 5. It's like, here's Naomi, what happens? Husband dies. Oh, they marry Moabites and they die. And what's happened? And here's this woman left with nothing. She's left with nothing. Now, as the story unfolds, at the end, what do we see? Her emptiness is reversed. You see, she winds up being blessed. So, now Ruth is a very huge part of that. So I have really no quarrels about the title. But I just want you to see in terms of the plot how it goes. Okay. In 1, 6, and 7 it says, then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited His people and given them food. Famine's over. The Lord has now given His people food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. She decides to return to Bethlehem, with Orpah and Ruth following, because she's heard that the Lord has brought an end to the famine that had driven her family to Moab in the first place. God has acted to bless His people, and the report of that kind of serves as a kind of turning point for the family's story. Their fate and destiny is going to be different now. Okay, so you have this kind of turn in the plot, and the 3 of them, they actually begin their journey from Moab back to Bethlehem in verse 7. And then in 8 through 10 it says, but Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, no, we will return with you to your people. Now at some point on the road, Naomi, she urges Orpah and Ruth to each return to her mother's house. Somewhere on this journey, they're leaving Moab, they're on their way to Bethlehem, and here on the road she tells them to return. And this conversation, it presumably happens at some kind of point of no return. Okay, where you're here, where it was time, turn back now if you're going to. Here we are going with them on the journey. Okay, well, this is far enough now, you got to decide. And she tells them to turn back. Maybe it was customary to accompany someone out of town for a certain distance. Okay, and you can see something like that in Genesis 18:16. So maybe that was a custom where somebody's leaving, you accompany them out of town, but there was kind of a distance how far you did that, and this occurs at that boundary. Then says to them, listen, no, you guys go ahead and you turn back to your mother's house. You go back there. Now the phrase mother's house rather than father's house is kind of interesting. It gets a lot of play and a lot of discussion. Naomi may have been referring to a custom that associated the arrangement of marriages with the mother's house. You see, the mother's house, it occurs in contexts that have to do with love and marriage. And we see in verse 9, it expresses Naomi's desire for Orpah and Ruth to have fulfilling second marriages, so maybe that's what it's about. Okay, and then again, maybe it's simply a way of saying, listen, designed to contrast their mother's position with her position as mother-in-law by saying, go back to your mother's house. Okay, whatever is going on there, she says, go back to your mother's house. And in urging them to turn back, she's doing what she thinks is best for them, given her sense of her disfavor with God. See, that's what's crucial to see, I think, is that she sees herself as under God's thumb, that He is after her. He is her enemy. He has drawn a line against her and said, I'm after you. That's her perception of what's going on. And given that, she's saying, look, turning back is best for you. You need to turn back. See, perceiving that God's hand is against her, at that point, she has no hope. No hope regarding the future of anybody who casts their lot with her. Why in the world would you want to hook your wagon to me? Can't you see that I'm cursed of God? Look at what happened to me. I come over here and what happens? Husband's dead. Son's dead. I have no children. No, you don't want anything to do with me. God is after me, and that will spill over onto you. So that's what's going on, I think. See, better to return to Moab than to follow this aging widow who, without God on her side, she offers no hope of a new husband for her daughters-in-law, and thus no hope of the blessing of family. Don't come with me. Because the only thing you can come with me is going to be tears. Because I am an enemy of God for some reason I don't understand. But, it's there, it's obvious. I'm getting hammered. Now, she prays for the Lord to demonstrate His hesed toward Orpah and Ruth, to demonstrate His devotion to their welfare, as they had demonstrated hesed toward her and toward her sons who are now dead. You see, they had demonstrated tremendous devotion and loyalty to her and to her sons, and now He prays for God to give that to them. See, to go ahead and show that to them. One expression of that hesed, a devotion to their welfare, would be Him granting them a fulfilling second marriage. So that's what He says, you return, and may God bless you in that, and may you find, each of you in the house of her husband. So He wants to, she's praying for that. So she recognizes that Yahweh is God of all. But she recognizes that God, Yahweh, He's God of all, even in Moab. But so even in Moab, it's not like God is some territorial God and His power or whatever doesn't extend to Moab. And she's willing to ask for His blessing of others, despite her sense of His hostility toward Him. So she says, listen, I know that I'm in the doghouse. I know that I'm a target. But as far as I can tell, you're not, although you did lose your husbands. But she winds up saying she's willing to pray for that. Now here's Frederick Bush says, to have Orpah and Ruth return to Moab means that she must journey home utterly alone and desolate, having lost all. But to have them return to Judah with her means asking them to renounce all hope of the life she now implores Yahweh to give them. You see, that's not really true, is it? Because we know how the story turns out. But that's how she thinks. Now, why does she think that? She thinks that she has no hope because she sees herself as God's target. I am His enemy, and there is no hope for anyone who is the enemy of Yahweh. And so she has no hope. He says, faced with this dilemma, she has no real choice. To the calamity of losing home, husband, and son, she must now add another, inflicted this time by herself. She must return home alone. So she feels that under the circumstances, she must say to them, you have no future with me. You need to go back to Moab. Because hooking your wagon to one cursed of God, you're going to get the spillover and it's going to be bad. I can offer you no husband. God is not going to do that for me. You're not going to be blessed in following this way. So I think that's what he said. Now Naomi then, she kisses Orpah and Ruth goodbye, and then they all begin sobbing aloud over the prospect of not seeing each other again. The pain is just too much, and then Orpah and Ruth, they protest through tears saying, no, they said to her, no, we'll return with you to your people. Okay, this goodbye is just too much. You see this, I thought of Paul, it's goodbye to the Ephesian elders. This weeping and crying, look, no, we'll go with you back to your people. And then we're of course not going to have time for this, but we have the second now. We have the second exchange, which I'll read and say something about, and then we'll, Lord willing, pick up next week. He says, but Naomi said, turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? And I'll explain the modification here of the ESV. He says, my daughters, why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I'm too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for things are too bitter for me for you to share, for the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Okay, when I say it's modified, you see the little brackets that I put here? Right down here in verse 13, no, my daughters, for, then a little bracket. What I've substituted there is the translation of Frederick Bush. Bush is an eminent Hebrew scholar. He wrote the commentary in the Word Biblical Commentary series. And this clause here is subject to a lot of different ways of interpreting it and translating it. That's Bush's translation, and I favor that. I think that's what's being said here, where she says, no, my daughters, for things are too bitter for me for you to share. That's what I was telling you, this idea where she says, listen, you don't want to come with me because I'm God's enemy. You don't want to come with me. Things are too bitter for share. For the hand of the Lord, that's back to the ESV, the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Now Naomi, in these verses, she insists that they turn back, and she asks this rhetorical question, why will you go with me? Okay, that's the meaning, that's crazy. Why are you going to go with me? The point of which is that it's foolish for them to come with her because they would be better off in their own country. I mean, why do you want to do that? You're going to slit your own throat. Go back, you'll be better there. And she makes clear through a rhetorical question that she's too old to have children and thus too old to provide any future husbands for them. That strikes us as bizarre. But you recall the widow Tamar in Genesis 38. She was waiting for her deceased husband's brother Shelah, to grow up, so he could become her husband. So she's saying, I'm not going to be able to have any kids to grow up and become your husbands. And even if I could conceive and have the kid tonight, would you really wait that long? She's telling him, look, that's crazy. You need to go back. We'll pick up next week, Lord willing. Thank you.